Welcome back to Fireside Whodunits, my dear friends. I'm Alistair Gray, and tonight we return to the fog-kissed world of Hercule Poirot. Pour yourself a whiskey or perhaps a cup of cocoa and let the Thames wind carry us across Blackheath to the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, where the stars themselves seem to conspire in murder. If you're listening from a snowy cabin in Canada, a balcony in Mumbai, or tucked up in a London flat, do leave a comment below and tell me where you are tonight. Chapter 1. The House That Measures Time. The fog that night was thick enough to swallow sound. It drifted in slow, deliberate coils across Blackheath, muffling the distant bells of river buoys and the low, mournful horns of steamers making their way down to the sea. High upon its hill, the Royal Observatory stood like a silent red brick fortress, its copper domes turned the color of old blood by the gas lamps along the path. Somewhere inside that fortress, the clocks ticked with the authority of an empire, and the great meridian itself, an invisible brass line set into the courtyard stones, divided the globe in two with the calm arrogance of a nation that still believed it owned the world. Hercule Poirot arrived at 23 minutes past 7 in the evening, precisely as the invitation had requested. His taxi, an Austin 12 with a driver who clearly resented the climb, wheezed to a halt beside the Flamsteed gate. Poirot stepped down, paid the man with exact change and a murmured merci, then paused to adjust the angle of his Homburg against the damp. The fog pressed against his mustaches like a living thing. He disliked fog. It disordered the mind. Yet there was something fitting about arriving at the House of Universal Order wrapped in London's favorite disguise. A porter in a navy greatcoat and peaked cap appeared from the mist, lantern raised. "Mr. Poirot, sir? Sir Jonathan's compliments. This way, if you please." They walked beneath the arch of the gatehouse and into the courtyard where the meridian line gleamed faintly under the lamps. Poirot's patent shoes clicked across it, east to west in a single stride, and he permitted himself a small, private smile. To cross from one hemisphere to the other so casually was a pleasure few men appreciated. The porter led him past the handsome octagon room, so called because Sir Christopher Wren had once imagined it as the heart of the observatory, and up the shallow steps of the south building. Warm light spilled from the windows and the smell of coal smoke and roasting chestnuts drifted on the air. Poirot inhaled with approval. Civilization, at least, had found its way to the top of the hill. Sir Jonathan Bracewell awaited him in the library, a long, low room lined with star charts and leather-bound volumes of the Greenwich observations. The Astronomer Royal was a tall man gone slightly to stoop, with the untidy white hair of a man who has spent too many nights forgetting to remove his spectacles before rubbing his eyes. His dinner jacket was impeccable, but the cuffs were frayed. An astronomer's salary, Poirot reflected, did not stretch as far as an astronomer's imagination. "My dear Poirot." Sir Jonathan's handshake was warm, almost anxious. "You cannot know what a relief it is to see a friendly face. These last weeks, well, the stars have been unkind." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "The stars, mon ami, are never kind. They are merely truthful. It is we who are unkind to one another." Sir Jonathan gave a short, tired laugh and poured 2 glasses of sherry from a decanter on the sideboard. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, the fog pressed its pale face against the windows as though trying to listen. Over dinner, served in the small dining room that looked out across the dark expanse of the park, Poirot was introduced to the little society that inhabited the observatory that winter. They were few, and each carried the faint aura of isolation that comes from living where the night is more important than the day. Dr. Edwin Harrow sat at Sir Jonathan's right, a striking woman of perhaps 34 with raven hair drawn severely back, and eyes the color of a winter sea. She wore a dinner gown of deep emerald silk that managed to look both expensive and slightly out of place among the star charts, as though a comet had decided to dress for the opera. She spoke little at first, but when she did, her voice was low, precise, and carried the faintest trace of a West Country burr that no amount of Cambridge polish had quite erased. Poirot noted the way her fingers kept returning to the stem of her glass, turning it exactly 1/4 rotation each time, as if measuring an invisible arc. Opposite her lounged Captain Reginald Thorne, Reggie to anyone who had served with him in the war, now in his 48th year and fighting a losing battle with the whiskey bottle. His face was handsome in the weathered style of a man who has spent too long on quarter-decks, but the eyes were red-rimmed and the hand that lifted the glass trembled just enough to betray him. He told a joke about the Leonids that made no one laugh, then stared moodily into the fire. At the foot of the table sat Miss Beatrice Langley, Sir Jonathan's private secretary. She was 29, plain in the way that efficient women sometimes allow themselves to become when no one troubles to look twice, and she wore a brown velvet dress that had been fashionable 3 seasons earlier. Her gaze rested on Sir Jonathan with a devotion so fierce it was almost palpable. Whenever he spoke, she leaned forward a fraction as though his words were oxygen. Poirot, who missed very little, saw the pain flicker across her face when Sir Jonathan turned to Dr. Harlow with a smile of particular warmth. The 5th member of the party arrived late, apologizing in careful, accented English. Herr Otto Kessler was a thick-set man of 55 with a watchmaker's stoop and round spectacles that magnified pale blue eyes. He had been seconded from the Potsdam Observatory to assist with the refit of the great 28-inch refractor, and he carried with him the faint scent of machine oil and Black Forest tobacco. There was something of the automaton about him, movements precise, conversation minimal, a nod for every please and thank you. Poirot noticed that Captain Thorne's gaze lingered on the German with the old hostility of 1918. Dinner passed with the polite surface chatter of people who have worked together too long and like one another too little. The Leonid meteor shower was discussed, the reason ostensibly for Poirot's invitation. Dr. Harlow spoke of radiant points and orbital velocities. Captain Thorne reminisced about seeing the 1910 shower from the bridge of a destroyer in the China Sea. Herr Kessler murmured something about perturbation theory that no one quite followed. After the port had circulated, Sir Jonathan proposed that they adjourn to the great equatorial dome to view the early stages of the display. The party rose with the slight awkwardness of people who have shared too many silences. They crossed the courtyard wrapped in coats and scarves, the fog thicker now and tasting of soot. The dome loomed above them like the head of some patient bronze giant. Inside, the air was colder, smelling of iron and ozone. The great telescope, 28 feet of gleaming brass and steel made by Sir Howard Grubb in Dublin, stood upon its massive equatorial mount, the huge tube inclined toward the open slit in the dome. The slit itself was a dark rectangle against the night sky, and through it the stars burned with that hard diamond brilliance that only comes in winter. Dr. Harlow took her place at the eyepiece with the ease of long practice. Captain Thorne busied himself with the slow-motion controls, though his hands were not quite steady. Herr Kessler checked the alignment of the guiding telescope with small, fussy adjustments. Miss Langley hovered at Sir Jonathan's elbow, ready with notebook and pencil should any observation need recording. Poirot stood a little apart, gloved hands clasped behind his back, watching them all with the bright, inquisitive eyes of a man who finds human behavior infinitely more fascinating than celestial mechanics. For an hour they watched the sky. Meteors streaked, some mere sparks, others leaving glowing trains that lingered like memories. At one point, Dr. Harlow gave a soft exclamation. A brilliant fireball that broke into fragments above the river, turning night briefly to green daylight. Even Poirot permitted himself a small ah of appreciation. It was past 1 o'clock when Sir Jonathan suggested that those who wished might retire, The shower would reach its peak between 3 and 4 in the morning, but not everyone kept astronomers' hours. Poirot pleaded fatigue, an untruth, for his mind was humming, and allowed Miss Langley to show him to the guest bedroom in the south building. It was a small chamber under the eaves with a dormer window looking toward the dome. A coal fire burned low in the grate, and someone had placed a hot water bottle between the sheets. Poirot was touched by the thoughtfulness. Before undressing, he stood at the window. The fog had lifted just enough to reveal the great dome, its slit still open like a watchful eye. A faint light glowed within, Dr. Harlow and Sir Jonathan remaining for one more plate exposure, perhaps. He watched the silhouettes move against the illumination. The tall, stooping figure of the Astronomer Royal, the slimmer, more upright shape of the woman who many said would be the next great name in British science. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock struck 2. Poirot turned away, removed his patent shoes, and placed them neatly side by side. He had the feeling, uncomfortable yet undeniable, that the orderly universe of Greenwich was about to become disordered. He was, as events would prove, entirely correct. But that is a matter for another chapter. For now, the observatory slept beneath its blanket of fog. The clocks ticked on, and high overhead the Leonids continued to fall, silent, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to the passions of the creatures who watched them from below. Chapter 2. The Impossible Fall. The morning of November 17th broke cold and pearl gray, the fog thinner now but still clinging to the hollows of the park like a guilty secret. At 6 o'clock precisely, Mr. Alfred Greaves, the observatory's night porter for 23 years, emerged from his lodge at the foot of the hill to perform his most sacred daily duty, the raising of the time ball. He climbed the steep path with the measured tread of habit, lantern swinging, breath pluming white in the raw air. At the summit he expected to see the familiar scarlet sphere already hoisted halfway up its mast, ready for the 1 o'clock drop that regulated half the chronometers in the world. Instead, the mast was bare. Greaves frowned, consulted his pocket watch, 6 minutes past the hour, and continued toward the great dome. The silence felt wrong. No clatter of breakfast from the south building kitchen, no faint smell of pipe tobacco drifting from Sir Jonathan's study window. Only the low, mournful cry of gulls wheeling above the river far below. The main door of the dome stood closed. That in itself was unusual. Sir Jonathan often left it ajar so the night's damp could escape. Greaves tried the handle. Locked. He knocked, once, twice, then put his shoulder to the oak and felt the unyielding resistance of the internal bolt. A small, cold finger traced itself down his spine. He hurried back down the path, boots slipping on wet cobbles, and telephoned the police from the lodge. The sergeant at Blackheath Station listened without interrupting, then said only, "Stay where you are, Mr. Greaves. Don't touch anything else." By 8:45, the courtyard was no longer quiet. 2 constables stood awkwardly beneath the meridian line while a photographer from the yard unpacked his tripod. Inspector Japp, mufflered, bad-tempered, and wishing himself anywhere else, strode ahead of the group, barking orders that the fog swallowed almost at once. And behind him, immaculate in dove-gray overcoat and carrying a Malacca cane as though it were a scepter, walked Hercule Poirot. Japp spotted him and groaned aloud. "I might have known. The one morning I'm due at Margate with the wife, and who turns up but the blessed Belgian bloodhound." Poirot inclined his head. "Bon matin, Inspector. You will observe that the universe arranges these little ironies with the precision of Greenwich itself." Together they approached the dome. A sergeant had already forced the lock with a jemmy. The heavy door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a cavern of shadows and cold iron. The smell that greeted them was unmistakable. The sweet metallic scent of fresh blood. Sir Jonathan Bracewell lay on his back beneath the great telescope, arms flung wide as though in supplication to the indifferent stars. A single dark hole pierced the left breast of his waistcoat. The blood had soaked through to form a near-perfect circle the size of a crown piece. His eyes were open, reflecting the pale morning light that now spilled through the open slit high above. Jap knelt, touched the dead man's cheek, and swore softly. Cold as mutton. Dead 6 hours at least. Poirot did not approach the body at once. Instead, he walked slowly around the circumference of the observing floor, his gaze traveling from the bolted door to the 3 high windows, each latched firmly from the inside and coated with undisturbed frost, to the narrow iron staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. The polished wooden floorboards bore only one set of footprints, Sir Jonathan's own, leading from the control desk to the spot where he had fallen. They ended there. "No sign of a weapon," Jap announced after a cursory search. "No revolver, no rifle, nothing. And before you ask, no, the slit's 30 feet up and barely wide enough for a cat." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Yet a man has been shot through the heart at close range. Powder burns, you observe? The assassin stood almost upon him. He crouched beside the body, gloved fingers hovering but never quite touching. From the waistcoat pocket protruded the corner of a folded note. Poirot drew it out with exquisite care. "Meet me in the Dome at 2 a.m. Come alone or the Harlow scandal breaks tomorrow. A friend." The handwriting was printed in coarse capitals, deliberately disguised. Jap read it over his shoulder and whistled. "Blackmail, that narrows the field." "Perhaps," Poirot murmured. "Or perhaps it widens it. A forgery is the easiest thing in the world when one wishes to cast suspicion widely." He straightened and surveyed the silent company now gathered in the doorway. Dr. Harlow pale as parchment, one hand pressed to her throat. Captain Thorne unshaven and reeking faintly of last night's whiskey. Miss Langley clutching a handkerchief as though it were a lifeline. Herr Kessler standing a little apart, expression unreadable behind the thick spectacles. And above them all loomed the telescope itself, its great tube still pointed for no reason that anyone could explain straight down at the floor where the Astronomer Royal lay dead. "Mon Dieu," Poirot said softly, almost to himself. "A man is shot in a room locked and bolted from within. The only footprints are his own. The only door remains fastened. The windows are virgin with frost. And the weapon, pft, has vanished into the ether like Persephone's tears." He turned to Jap with sudden briskness. "Come, my friend. We have much to do. The impossible has occurred, which means naturally that it is not impossible at all. Somewhere in this temple of exactitude, someone has made a very exact mistake." Outside, the time ball, raised at last by a trembling porter, dropped at 1 o'clock precisely, as it had every day since 1833. The sharp clack echoed across the park and down toward the river, telling the world that time marched on, indifferent to the fact that the man who had guarded it for 20 years would never wind a chronometer again. Chapter 3, The Five Who Remain. The octagon room had never felt smaller. Though its white walls rose gracefully to Wren's elegant ceiling and its tall windows looked out upon a gray park dissolving into mist, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, unshed tears, and the particular silence that follows violent death. They sat in a rough semicircle around the fireplace like survivors of a shipwreck. Dr. Evelyn Harlow upright on a spindle-legged chair, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles showed ivory. Captain Thorne sprawled in an armchair, legs stretched as though he still expected a steward to bring him gin. Miss Langley perched on the edge of a sofa, eyes red but dry now, staring at nothing. Herr Kessler standing by the great orrery, one finger unconsciously tracing the brass orbit of Mars, and Hercule Poirot in the center, small and immaculate, turning a pencil end over end between delicate fingers. Inspector Japp closed the door with unnecessary firmness and cleared his throat. Right then. Until the chief arrives from the yard, I'm in charge. Nobody leaves the building without my say-so. Clear? No one answered. The fire settled with a small avalanche of coal. Poirot spoke first, his voice soft yet carrying to every corner. Let us begin. Not with where each of you was, but with what each of you stood to lose if Sir Jonathan lived another week. A ripple passed through the room like wind across water. He turned to Dr. Harlow. Doctor, you are about to be awarded the Copley Medal, the highest honor of the Royal Society. There were rumors that certain spectrographic plates had been, shall we say, enhanced. Sir Jonathan had begun to investigate. Evelyn Harlow lifted her chin. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. My work on the Cepheid distance scale is impeccable. Yet he had summoned you to his study only yesterday afternoon. Miss Langley overheard raised voices. Miss Langley flushed scarlet. I was passing the door. Sir Jonathan said something about withdrawing the nomination, and Dr. Harlow replied that if he did, she would bring the whole observatory down with her. I thought it was just temper. Dr. Harlow's laugh was brittle. Temper, yes, I have fought for 12 years to be taken seriously in a world of men who still believe a woman's place is at the tea tray. I spoke hastily. That is all? Poirot's gaze moved to Captain Thorne. And you, mon capitaine? Sir Jonathan discovered that 24 bottles of the observatory's best whiskey had vanished from the cellar, replaced by bottles filled with cold tea. Your initials were on the requisition forms. Thorne's face darkened. I've a weakness, I admit it. The old man was going to sack me quietly so the Navy wouldn't hear of it. I'd have been finished. But murder? Good God, man, I was blind drunk in my bed by midnight. Ask anyone. We will, Japp said grimly. Poirot turned to Miss Langley. She shrank a little under the gentle scrutiny. Mademoiselle, you have been in love with Sir Jonathan for many years. You wrote him letters, tender, passionate letters, that he returned last month with a note asking you to cease. You were seen burning something in the stove only yesterday. Tears welled again. I burned my own letters after he gave them back. I was ashamed. He was always kind. He said he valued my work but could never return my feelings, that was all. Poirot inclined his head sympathetically, then looked toward the silent German. And you, Herr Kessler, your secondment ends in 6 weeks and it will not be renewed. There are whispers, perhaps unjust, that you have been copying the new photoelectric guiding system for certain interests in Berlin. Kessler's face remained expressionless. I am a scientist, not a spy. My government asked only for open publications. If Sir Jonathan believed otherwise, he was mistaken. Poirot let the silence stretch until the ticking of the regulator clock on the wall became almost painful. 4 motives, he said at last. Jealousy, disgrace, unrequited love, suspicion of treachery. Yet none explains how any one of you entered a locked and bolted dome, shot a man through the heart, and departed, leaving the bolt still shot on the inside. He rose and walked to the window. The park lay sodden under a slow drizzle. Let us establish the night's chronology with precision. At 1:15, Dr. Harlow and Sir Jonathan were still at the telescope. I observed their silhouettes myself. By 2 o'clock, the slit was, closed. I noticed the darkness when I woke briefly. At 3:10, the porter saw a light in Dr. Harlow's bedroom window as he made his rounds. Captain Thorne was heard snoring by the scullery maid at 2:30. Miss Langley claims to have been awake until 3 reading. Herr Kessler says he slept soundly and heard nothing. Sir Jonathan was almost certainly dead by then. Japp flipped open his notebook. The police surgeon says between 145 and 245. Single shot or .455 caliber, close range. No bullet recovered yet. We're searching the dome again. Poirot turned back to the room. One more thing. Captain Thorne, you possess a Webley service revolver, do you not? Thorne sat up straighter. Every officer kept his sidearm after the war. Mine's in my dressing table drawer. May we see it? 10 minutes later, the revolver lay on the library table, oiled and gleaming. Jap broke it open with practiced efficiency. 5 cartridges in one empty chamber. Someone fired it recently, he said. Thorne stared at the weapon as though it had betrayed him. That's impossible. I haven't touched it in months. Poirot picked it up delicately, sniffed the barrel. Cordite. Within the last fortnight, I should say. He laid the revolver down again and regarded the 5 pale faces. Someone among you is a very good actor, he said quietly. Someone entered that dome after the bolt was shot, fired this weapon or its twin, and departed without disturbing frost, footprints, or fastenings. Someone, in short, performed a miracle. And Hercule Poirot, he permitted himself the ghost of a smile, does not believe in miracles. Outside, the drizzle thickened into rain, drumming on the copper dome like impatient fingers. Inside the octagon room, the 5 who remained waited for the little Belgian to tell them how one of them had cheated both time and space to commit the perfect murder. They would have a long wait. Chapter 4. Clues among the constellations. Rain lashed the high windows of the dome all afternoon, turning the world beyond the glass into a gray blur. Inside, the air was colder than ever, thick with the smell of wet wool, carbolic, and the faint sweetness of blood that no amount of scrubbing would quite erase. Constables came and went on silent feet, their lanterns throwing long, wavering shadows across the polished floor. Poirot moved like a small, meticulous cat among the machinery of the heavens. He climbed the iron ladder to the observing chair, examined the great eyepiece, ran a gloved fingertip along the brass slow-motion rods. Nothing. Then he descended and began a slow circuit of the floor, eyes fixed 6 inches ahead of his feet. Halfway round, he stopped. A single strand of silk, pale green, almost luminous, had caught on a rivet of the telescope pier. Poirot teased it free with tweezers and held it to the light. A woman's stocking, torn in a ragged ladder. Dr. Harlow, when Ozantsaidabu shown it later, identified the color as identical to a pair she had worn the previous evening. But I left them folded on my chair, she said, voice thin. I never wear stockings in the dome. They ladder on the rungs. Jap grunted. Convenient. Poirot merely tucked the strand into an envelope and continued his search. Near the base of the mounting, he found a second treasure. A faint circular scrape in the dust, perhaps 18 inches across, as though something heavy had been rotated a few degrees and then returned to its original place. He knelt, measured it with a pocket rule, and made a small, satisfied noise. Up in the narrow gallery that ringed the dome, he discovered a third curiosity. One of the frosted window panes bore a thumbprint on the inside, clear, recent, and at the height of a tall man. Captain Thorne was summoned and obliged to press his thumb beside it. The ridges did not match. Someone stood here and looked down, Poirot murmured. Yet the window remained latched, curious. In the residence, other discoveries were being made. In the kitchen stove, half consumed, lay the remnants of a letter. The fragments that survived the flames read, "If you announce her medal tomorrow, I swear I will ruin you both." The handwriting was spidery, agitated. Miss Langley turned white when it was shown to her. "That is not mine," she whispered, "though I might have written something like it in anger. But I burned nothing except my own letters." Jap was less delicate. "We'll have an expert compare it, miss. Best be sure." Outside, beneath the dome's outer wall, a constable found footprints in the soaked flower bed, large, square-toed, heading toward the brickwork and then simply ceasing 6 feet short of the wall, as though the walker had been lifted bodily into the air. The impressions were deep at the heel, lighter at the toe. Someone running, perhaps, or someone pretending to run. The size matched Captain Thorne's boots. By late afternoon, Jap had heard enough. He placed Thorne under formal arrest and led him away while the captain protested in a voice that cracked between fury and fear. "I was asleep, damn you. I never left the building." The door closed behind them. The remaining 3 suspects stood in the library like statues left over from a more orderly age. Poirot, however, was not satisfied. He asked permission. No, he insisted to be left alone in the dome after dark. At 9 o'clock, the constables withdrew, the great door was locked from the outside, and the only light came from a single green-shaded lamp beside the telescope. Poirot sat in the observing chair, legs crossed, hands folded in his lap, and stared upward at the closed slit. For a long time, he did nothing at all. Then he rose, walked to the control desk, and began to move the telescope. Not much, a few degrees only, watching the massive counterweights descend with their familiar ponderous grace into the brick-lined pit beneath the floor. He listened to the cables sing. He listened to the silence that followed. And when the weights reached bottom and the gears locked with a soft metallic sigh, he smiled the small private smile of a man who has just heard a confession. Later, when Jap returned to collect him, Poirot was standing beneath the telescope, gazing downward at the exact spot where Sir Jonathan had died. "You have found something?" the inspector asked. "I have found everything," Poirot replied quietly. "Except the one thing that is not there." "Meaning?" "Meaning, mon ami, that the murder was committed with a revolver that was never in the dome at all. And the man who fired it was 50 yards away, fast asleep and entirely innocent." He tapped the floor twice with his cane. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall look beneath." Jap stared at him as though he had taken leave of his senses. "Beneath?" "There's 20 tons of iron down there." "Precisely," said Poirot, and his eyes glittered like winter stars. 20 tons. And one very small lie. Chapter 5, The Second Crime and the Twisted Sky. The night that followed was restless, as though the observatory itself refused to sleep, while its master lay cold in the police mortuary. Wind had risen, driving the rain in angry sheets against the copper dome so that the whole building murmured like a ship at sea. In the south building, the fires burned low, clocks ticked too loudly, and every creak of old timber sounded like a footstep. Poirot had not gone to bed. He sat fully dressed in the octagon room, a single lamp pooling gold on the table before him, arranging and rearranging small objects. The torn silk stocking, the scrap of burned letter, the brass cartridge case recovered from Captain Thorne's revolver, and a brass plumb bob he had borrowed from Herr Kessler's toolkit. From time to time he consulted his pocket watch, nodded to himself, and returned to his silent meditation. At 23 minutes past 1, the electric lights in the corridor flickered once, twice, then died entirely. The observatory was plunged into a darkness so complete it seemed to have weight. Somewhere a woman cried out, brief, stifled, quickly silenced. Poirot rose without haste, took a small electric torch from his overcoat pocket, and stepped into the corridor. The air smelled suddenly of burning paraffin and something sharper, smoke. He moved swiftly now, past the darkened kitchen, past the library where embers still glowed, toward the narrow passage that led to the photographic archive. A red flicker danced beneath the door. When he threw it open, flames were already licking at the shelves of glass plates. Thousands of irreplaceable records of variable stars, nebulae, the slow heartbeat of the heavens. A figure knelt before the lowest shelf, back turned, feeding plates into the fire with frantic haste. The glow lit a woman's profile, pale, tear-streaked, unmistakable. "Stop, mademoiselle," Poirot said quietly. Miss Langley whirled, eyes wild, a box of swan vestas still clutched in one trembling hand. For a moment she looked as though she might throw herself bodily into the flames. Then her shoulders sagged and the matches fell with a soft clatter. "I only wanted them gone," she whispered. "The plates he was going to show the Royal Society tomorrow. The ones that proved she lied." Poirot stepped forward and stamped out the fire with quick, precise movements. The smoke stung his eyes, but the worst of the blaze was smothered. Behind him, footsteps pounded, Jap and 2 constables alerted by the smell. They took Miss Langley gently by the arms. She went without resistance, head bowed, tears cutting clean channels through the soot on her cheeks. Later in the library, with brandy forced between her lips and a blanket round her shoulders, she spoke in a voice so low they had to lean close to hear. "I did not kill him. I swear it on my soul. I loved him too much for that. But when I saw the light still burning in the dome at 2 o'clock, I knew he was with her. I crept across the courtyard in my stockings, that is how the ladder happened, and climbed the outer ladder to the gallery window. I only wanted to see, to know for certain. Then I heard the shot, one shot, and when I looked down he was falling. I fled. I thought she had done it." Jap scratched his head. "But the dome was bolted from the inside. You couldn't have seen anything through a closed slit." "The slit was open," she insisted. "Only a little, but open, and the lights inside went out just after the shot. 4 minutes of darkness, maybe 5. Then they came back and the slit closed itself. I swear that is what I saw." Poirot's gaze sharpened. 4 minutes exactly, mademoiselle?" I counted my heartbeats. I was terrified. Jap turned triumphantly to Poirot. "There you are. The lights failed. Someone cut the cable, slipped in, did the deed, slipped out again. Simple." Poirot shook his head slowly. "Non, mon ami. The master switch is in the basement strong room. The only key hung round Sir Jonathan's own neck. We found it there this morning. And the cable is intact. No, the darkness was arranged, deliberately, precisely for those 4 minutes." He rose and walked to the window. Dawn was still hours away, but the rain had ceased and a few stars showed coldly between ragged clouds. "One more experiment," he said almost to himself. "Tonight the sky itself will confess." An hour later, wrapped in coats and scarves, they stood again in the dome. Poirot, Jap, Dr. Harlow, Herr Kessler, and a weeping Miss Langley supported between 2 constables. The great slit was opened wide. The telescope had been returned to its former position, pointing downward like an accusing finger. Poirot took the plumb bob on its silk cord and lowered it through a small, removable panel in the observing floor, a maintenance hatch few remembered existed. The bob descended into the black throat of the counterweight pit, swinging gently. "Observe," he said softly. He released a catch. Somewhere deep below, gears engaged with a muted groan. The massive counterweights began their slow descent. The plumb bob rose toward them, drawn upward by the same cables that moved 2 tons of iron. When the weights reached the bottom, 4 minutes later, almost to the second, the lights, which Poirot had arranged to be cut by a simple timed fuse, flickered and died. In the darkness, the plumb bob vanished entirely into the pit. The lights returned. The bob hung motionless once more, innocent. Jap stared, mouth open. "Mon Dieu," Dr. Harlow breathed, the first crack in her composure. Poirot closed the panel with a small, decisive click. "Now," he said, turning to face them all, his eyes brighter than the lantern in Jap's hand. "We understand how a man may be shot in a locked room by a murderer who was never in the room at all. And we understand why the telescope pointed downward. It was not moved after the crime. It was the crime." He let the silence settle like frost. "Tomorrow," he continued gently. We shall recover the revolver from its hiding place among the counterweights. And then, mes amis, one of you will tell us the rest. Chapter 6. The Revelation in the Octagon Room. The afternoon was dying in watery light when they gathered for the last time in the Octagon Room. Rain no longer fell, but the sky hung low and sullen, pressing the park into shades of pewter and ash. The fire had been laid high. Its crackle was the only cheerful thing in the room. They sat in the same places as before, yet everything had changed. Captain Thorne was free again, hollow-eyed from a night in the cells, but exonerated. Miss Langley, pale and composed in a clean gray dress, kept her gaze fixed on the flames as though warmth might still reach her heart. Herr Kessler stood behind his chair rather than sit, hands clasped behind his back like a soldier at ease. Dr. Evelyn Harlow alone appeared unchanged, back straight, chin high, the emerald brooch at her throat catching the firelight with cold fire. Poirot entered last. He paused on the threshold, surveyed them all with the bright, unhurried glance of a man who has arranged every piece upon the board exactly where he wishes it, and took his seat at the head of the table. Mesdames, Messieurs, he began, voice soft yet carrying to the furthest corner. We have traveled together through a maze of lies. It is time to emerge into the light. He placed 5 objects in a careful row: the torn green stocking, the burned letter fragment, the spent cartridge case, the plumb bob on its silk cord, and finally a small brass key that had not been there before. First, the impossible crime, he said. A man shot in a locked dome. Bolt shot from within, frost undisturbed, no weapon found. Many possibilities were considered. Ice bullets, strings through the slit, accomplices on the roof. All ingenious, all wrong. He picked up the plumb bob and let it swing gently. The truth lay beneath our feet. The great telescope is balanced by 2 tons of iron counterweights that descend into a brick-lined pit when the shutter opens. That pit was relined last year under the supervision of Dr. Harlow herself. A false floor was added, removable panels disguised as ordinary brickwork. Beneath one panel, a cavity exactly large enough for a man or a woman to crouch. Dr. Harlow's lips parted, but no sound came. At 2 o'clock, Sir Jonathan received a note, forged by the murderer, asking him to meet in the dome. He went alone, bolted the door out of habit, and opened the slit to speak through it. At that moment, the shutter motor was engaged from the control desk. As the counterweights descended, a Webley revolver, Captain Thorne's, stolen weeks earlier, rose on a silk cord tied to the weights themselves. The muzzle passed through a missing brick directly beneath the telescope's center. 1 shot. The bullet entered Sir Jonathan's heart from below at an upward angle that perfectly mimicked a chest wound delivered at close range. Jap drew a sharp breath. But the gun! How did it disappear? Poirot smiled without humor. Patience, mon ami. The cord was soaked in methylated spirit. A candle, timed to burn for 4 minutes, was fixed to the weight. When the flame reached the cord, it parted. The revolver fell among the counterweights, 20 tons of iron where no one would ever think to look. The lights, extinguished by a simple fuse in the junction box, concealed the final seconds. When they returned, the slit closed itself by gravity. The false panel was replaced from below, and the murderer climbed out through the basement service tunnel that connects pit to residence. The entire performance required less than 5 minutes. He turned to Dr. Harlow. You, Doctor, possess the knowledge, the access, and the motive. Sir Jonathan had discovered not only falsified spectrographs, but embezzlement. Thousands of pounds diverted from the Greenwich Fund into accounts controlled by you. Exposure meant prison, not mere disgrace. You chose murder. Dr. Harlow rose slowly. This is fantasy. You have no proof. Poirot lifted the small brass key. This morning the pit was opened. The revolver was recovered exactly where calculation placed it, wrapped in oilskin, 1 round fired. Your fingerprints, Doctor, are on the oilskin, and on the candle stub, and on the forged note luring Sir Jonathan to his death. For a moment the room held its breath. Then Dr. Harlow moved, swift as a striking snake, snatching the heavy brass orrery from its stand and hurling it toward Poirot's head. He ducked. The globe shattered against the wall in a storm of flying planets. She was across the room in 3 strides, wrenching at the door, but Japp and Kessler were faster. She fought like a cornered animal, nails, teeth, knees, until the 2 men pinned her arms and Japp snapped on the cuffs. Her composure shattered at last. "He was going to destroy me," she screamed, hair wild about her face. "Everything I worked for, everything. I was greater than any of them, and he would have dragged me down for money." Miss Langley began to sob, not for the murderer, but for the man who had never loved her. Captain Thorne stared at the floor, fists clenched so tightly the knuckles showed white. Poirot watched the struggle with profound sadness. "You mistook precision for justice, madame," he said quietly. "The stars do not lie. Eventually, neither do men." As Dr. Harlow was led away, still spitting defiance, the rain began again, soft, relentless, washing the windows clean. In the sudden hush, the regulator clock struck 4, steady and indifferent, counting out the seconds of a world that had almost been fooled by a woman brilliant enough to make the heavens themselves accomplices in murder. Poirot stood alone beneath the meridian line a moment later, looking up at the great dome now closed and silent. "A fallen star," he murmured to the empty air. "But even fallen stars leave a trail if one knows how to read the sky." Chapter 7, Justice Beneath the Meridian Spring came late to Greenwich in 1928, as though the sky itself hesitated to warm a place that had seen such cold precision in murder. On the morning of the 23rd of April, the time ball dropped as always at 1 o'clock, crisp and scarlet against a sky the color of washed steel, and the river traffic set their chronometers by it without knowing that the hand which had once raised the signal now rested in a grave beneath the plane trees. Dr. Edwin Harrow had been tried at the Old Bailey in February. The court was packed. Half the Royal Society seemed to be there, either to see justice done or to watch a brilliant career implode. She conducted her own defense for 3 days with icy brilliance, cross-examining the ballistics expert until he stammered, reducing the fingerprint witness to near tears. On the 4th day, she dismissed counsel and addressed the jury in a voice so calm it chilled the blood. She spoke of barriers broken, of a world that punished women for daring, of how the stars themselves belonged to no nation and no sex. When she finished, strong men in the gallery wiped their eyes. The jury was out for 47 minutes. Guilty, the black cap, the sentence pronounced in the old form, the words falling like stones into still water. She met her end on the 9th of May at Pentonville. The newspapers reported that she walked to the scaffold without assistance, that she refused the hood, and that her last words, spoken clearly enough for the governor to hear, were, "Tell them the distance to the stars is still wrong." Afterwards, the observatory tried to heal. Captain Reginald Thorne took the pledge the day the verdict was read. He kept it too, though his hands shook for months. In the autumn, Sir Jonathan's successor appointed him observatory librarian, a quiet post among catalogues and bound volumes where the smell was of dust and old paper rather than whiskey. He moved through the corridors with a new stillness, speaking softly when he spoke at all, and on fine evenings he could be found on the terrace watching the sun sink behind the plane trees as though trying to memorize an equation he had once forgotten. Miss Beatrice Langley stayed on as secretary to the new Astronomer Royal. The brown velvet dress was replaced by quieter grays and navies, but something in her carriage had altered. One morning in June, Thorne found her in the library struggling with a heavy folio of lunar photographs. Without a word, he lifted it down for her. Their hands touched on the leather binding. Neither moved away. By Christmas, they were married in the little church at the foot of the hill, a ceremony so small that only Herr Kessler and Poirot were invited to witness it. Poirot sent a silver coffee service engraved with the Meridian line and the words order and method. Kessler himself returned to Potsdam in March, carrying a letter from the Royal Society that cleared his name entirely. Before he left, he presented the observatory with a beautiful new dividing engine of his own design. No one ever spoke of the war again in his hearing. The great 28-inch telescope was cleaned and realigned. The false floor in the counterweight pit was removed and bricked over for good. The revolver, cleaned, oiled, and anonymously returned, now hangs in a glass case at Scotland Yard with a discreet brass plate that reads simply, Greenwich, 1927. Poirot came back only once. It was a bright October afternoon the following year. He arrived unannounced, as was his habit, and found the courtyard almost deserted. The leaves were turning, drifting across the meridian line like slow golden meteors. He stood for a long time with his hat in his hands, looking up at the dome. Captain Thorne, now walking with barely a limp from the old shrapnel, found him there. "They've named the new building after him," Thorne said, nodding toward the foundation stones already laid to the east. "The Bracewell wing. Seems fitting." Poirot nodded. "A good man should leave something that measures more than time." Thorne hesitated. "Beatrice and we wanted to thank you, properly. You gave us back our lives." Poirot waved the gratitude away with a small, characteristic gesture. "I gave you only the truth, mon ami. The rest you accomplished yourselves." They walked together to the meridian line. Poirot placed one polished shoe on either side of the brass strip, east and west in a single stride, and smiled his neat, cat-like smile. "You know," Thorne said suddenly, "I still dream about it sometimes. That night, the shot, the dark." Poirot regarded him steadily. "And when you wake?" "I look at Beatrice asleep beside me, and I know the dark is finished. That," Poirot said softly, "is the only chronometer that matters." The time ball rose on its mast, scarlet against the pale sky. At 1 o'clock precisely it fell, the clack echoing across the park as it had every day for nearly a century. Poirot watched it drop, then turned up the collar of his overcoat. "Come, a taxi waits. London calls, and there is, I believe, a new exhibition of Egyptian antiquities at the British Museum. One must keep the little gray cells exercised." He walked away down the hill, a small, impeccable figure against the turning leaves, twirling his cane like a man who has put one small portion of the universe neatly back in its proper orbit. Behind him, the observatory settled into the gentle routine of science. Plates exposed, clocks compared, young astronomers arguing over coffee about the expanding universe. The scandal faded into footnotes and cautionary tales told to new assistants. The stars wheeled on, vast and indifferent. Yet sometimes, on still November nights when the Leonids return, the duty astronomer on the night watch will look up from the eyepiece and pause. For just a moment, the great dome seems to hold its breath, and the meridian line gleams a little brighter, as though somewhere a meticulous little Belgian with exquisitely waxed mustaches is smiling quietly at the order he once restored. And high overhead a meteor flames across the dark, brief, brilliant gone, leaving only the faint after-image of a fallen star that finally, at the last, pointed the way to truth. Chapter 8. Epilogue. Beneath a quiet sky, years passed like pages turned by an unseen hand. The observatory grew older with dignity. New wings rose where grass had once been. Electric lights replaced the soft gas mantles, and the great 28-inch refractor, once the largest in England, became a beloved relic that schoolchildren queued to peer through on Saturday afternoons. Yet certain evenings carried an echo, a hush that made even the youngest assistants speak more softly as they crossed the courtyard after dark. It was one such evening in November 1937, 10 years almost to the day, when Hercule Poirot returned without warning. He arrived in a taxi that labored up the hill as though reluctant to disturb the past. The driver, a cheerful cockney, helped the small elderly gentleman to the gate, accepted an excessively precise tip, and watched Poirot stand for a long moment beneath the arch, gloved hands clasped behind his back, looking up at the dome as though listening to a conversation no one else could hear. The porter on duty was new and did not recognize the famous visitor. Poirot gave his name simply as an old friend of Captain Thorne and asked if the librarian might be found. The porter telephoned the South Building, and minutes later Reggie Thorne himself appeared, gray now at the temples, thinner but steady-eyed and sober these 12 years. He stopped dead on the path, astonishment giving way to a slow, wondering smile. "Monsieur Poirot, they said a gentleman, but I never thought— Good Lord, sir, come in out of the cold." They walked together beneath the plane trees whose leaves lay thick and gold on the Meridian line. The air smelled of wood smoke and the river. Poirot's step was a fraction slower than it had been, but the moustache remained magnificent. The Homburg sat at its perfect angle, and the eyes were as brightly inquisitive as ever. "You are happy?" Poirot asked without preamble. Thorne gave a short, surprised laugh. "Happy? I wake every morning astonished that I am alive and that Beatrice chose me. We have a boy now, Jonathan, 8 years old, mad about telescopes. Yes, monsieur, I am happy. More than a man like me has any right to be." They entered the octagon room. Little had changed. The same regulator clock ticked, the same fire burned, though the chairs were newer and the star charts on the walls had been updated with spiral nebulae now known to be galaxies. Beatrice Thorne was there, arranging tea things on a low table. She turned, saw Poirot, and the tray trembled in her hands. "Monsieur, we read about your retirement to the country growing vegetable marrows. We thought never to see you again." Poirot bowed over her hand with old-world grace. "The marrows, madame, were a failure. They grew large but lacked sympathy. I prefer London and old friends." They sat. Tea was poured. Outside, dusk deepened to indigo and the first stars pricked through. Poirot accepted a slice of seed cake and regarded the couple with quiet satisfaction. "You will forgive an old man's curiosity," he said at last. "I have followed the newspapers. Dr. Harlow's name appears still in the astronomical journals. Her early papers on Cepheids are cited, though always with that small, terrible footnote. Does it pain you?" Beatrice set her cup down carefully. "At first, yes, I hated her for a long time. Then Jonathan, our son, asked why the big telescope was called the Grub lens, and I found myself telling him about the woman who once measured distances to the stars. Hate is heavy, monsieur. I laid it down." Thorne leaned forward. "We kept one thing, though. Come and see." He led Poirot across the courtyard to the dome. The great doors stood open. Inside, the telescope rested in its cradle like a sleeping beast. A small brass plaque had been affixed to the pier since Poirot's last visit. He approached and read by the light of Thorne's torch. "In memory of Sir Jonathan Bracewell, Astronomer Royal, 1885-1927, who taught us that time and truth must be measured with equal care. And in gratitude to Hercule Poirot, who restored both, erected by the staff and friends, 1935. Poirot stood very still. For once the fluent tongue was silent. At last he removed his hat and placed it over his heart. "You make an old man feel he has not lived entirely in vain," he said softly. Thorne cleared his throat. We thought you should know the pit is sealed forever. 20 tons of concrete. No one will ever hide there again. Poirot smiled then, a small, wistful curve. Good. Some doors should remain closed. They lingered a while longer beneath the open slit. The Leonids were returning. Already a handful of meteors scratched brief fire across the darkness. Poirot watched them with the absorbed pleasure of a child. See how they fall, he murmured, each one a reminder that even the heavens are not perfect. Yet order returns, always. Beatrice had joined them, bringing a rug against the night chill. She slipped her arm through her husband's and rested her head on his shoulder. "Will you stay the night?" she asked. "The guest room is always ready." Poirot shook his head gently. "Merci, madame, but London calls. There is a little restaurant in Soho where the chocolate is almost as I remember it in Brussels before the war. One must seize such pleasures while one may." They walked him to the gate. The taxi waited, engine purring. Before he climbed in, Poirot turned once more. "You have made of tragedy something gentle," he told them. "That is the rarest alchemy of all." Thorne saluted, half military, half awkward. Beatrice kissed Poirot on both cheeks, heedless of the mustache. As the taxi descended the hill, Poirot looked back. 2 figures stood beneath the arch, arm in arm, silhouetted against the glow from the dome. Above them a meteor burned bright and was gone, leaving only the quiet certainty that some stories, properly told, end not in darkness but in the small, steady light that follows. In the courtyard, the Meridian line gleamed faintly under the lamps, dividing the world as it always had. East and west, past and future, guilt and redemption. Poirot settled into the seat, adjusted his coat, and permitted himself one last satisfied sigh. "Order," he said to the night rushing past the window, "and method, and from time to time, a little mercy." The taxi turned onto the main road and was swallowed by London's glow, carrying the last witness home beneath a sky that had finally forgiven itself. Chapter 9. The Return of the Leonids. November 1946. 19 years had slipped by since the night the dome became a tomb, and the world had changed beyond recognition. London still carried its war scars, bombed gaps in terraces, boarded windows, the faint smell of soot that no amount of rebuilding could quite erase. Yet on the hill above Greenwich, the observatory stood untouched, its red bricks warmed by late autumn sun, the great dome serene against a sky washed clean by recent rain. Hercule Poirot was 81 now, though no one who saw him climb unaided from the staff car would have guessed it. The back was a fraction less straight, the step a shade more deliberate, but the eyes remained bright, and the moustache magnificent. He had come at the invitation of young Dr. Jonathan Thorne, Captain Thorne's son, who had written in a careful schoolboy hand, "Father says you once saved the observatory. The Leonids are returning and I am night assistant. Please come and watch with us. I have kept the guest room ready since I was small." Poirot had not been able to refuse. He arrived at dusk. The porter, grandson of old Mr. Greaves, saluted smartly and led him across the courtyard where the Meridian line now bore a discreet bronze plaque. Here stood Hercule Poirot, 1927-1946, friend of truth. Poirot pretended not to notice the tears that sprang unbidden to his eyes. Young Jonathan, tall, serious, already wearing the preoccupied look of those who live among stars, met him at the foot of the dome steps. Behind him stood his parents, Reggie Thorne, silver-haired but upright, and Beatrice, softer now, the lines around her eyes gentle rather than severe. They greeted Poirot as though he had merely stepped out for a newspaper and returned. Inside the dome, the great telescope had been fitted with a new photographic plate holder. War work had improved the alloys, yet the old brass and mahogany gleamed with the same loving polish. The counterweight pit remained sealed beneath its concrete lid, a silent monument. "We thought you might like to see the sky from the same place," Reggie said quietly. They opened the slit. The night was perfect, cold, windless, the stars hard and glittering. The old ritual began again. Slow-motion wheels turned, the dome rotated with its familiar sigh, and Poirot found himself seated in the observing chair exactly where Sir Jonathan had once sat. Young Jonathan adjusted the finder with reverent care. At 22 minutes past 10, the first bright Leonid flared across Perseus, leaving a train that lingered like green fire. Then another and another. The shower was building. Beatrice brought cocoa in thick observatory mugs. They drank in silence, watching the heavens burn. "Father told me everything," Jonathan said at last, voice low so as not to disturb the dark. "About the false floor, the candle, the revolver that rose like an avenging angel. I used to have nightmares about it when I was small. Then I realized you had turned a nightmare into something safe. A story with an ending." Poirot sipped his cocoa. "All stories must have endings, mon garçon. The universe itself will one day cool to stillness. But until then, we measure, we record, we remember." Reggie cleared his throat. "There's something else, monsieur. We never told you at the time. Didn't seem right. But Dr. Harlow wrote to Beatrice from prison. A long letter. She asked that it be burned unopened. Beatrice kept it instead." Beatrice drew a thin envelope from her cardigan pocket, yellowed and soft with handling. "I've carried it 19 years. I think tonight it belongs to you." Poirot took it with steady fingers. The writing on the front, small, precise, unrepentant, read simply, "To the woman who loved him better." He turned it over once, twice, then handed it back. "Burn it now," he said gently. "Some truths are heavier than knowledge." Beatrice walked to the small stove that warmed the dome on winter nights. She opened the door, the glow lighting her face, and slipped the letter inside. The paper caught at once curling black, then white ash. No one spoke until the last fragment vanished. Outside, the Leonids reached their peak. The sky was full of falling stars, silent, swift, glorious. One in particular blazed low across the river, breaking into fragments above the Isle of Dogs, turning night briefly to magnesium daylight. Young Jonathan gave a soft exclamation. "That one will be in the records forever." Poirot smiled, as all bright things should be. Much later, when the shower had faded to occasional sparks and the cold began to bite, they closed the slit and walked back across the courtyard. The Meridian line caught the moonlight, a thin silver thread between worlds. At the gate, the same staff car waited. Poirot paused, looking up at the three faces illuminated by the lamp over the arch. "You have made a life here," he said. "A good life. That is the only victory that matters." Reggie saluted, old habit returning. Beatrice kissed him on both cheeks. Young Jonathan, suddenly shy, offered his hand, then thought better and hugged the small Belgian instead. Poirot climbed into the car. As it pulled away, he looked back once. They stood together, father, mother, son, beneath the great dome that had once been a place of death and was now simply home. The car reached the main road. London's searchlights were long gone, but the city glowed softly under the peacetime stars. Poirot leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, a single meteor still burned, bright, brief, eternal. "Thus do we all fall," he murmured to the night, "and thus are we remembered." The observatory dwindled behind him, red brick and copper warmed by starlight, keeping its ancient vigil over time and memory and the quiet certainty that some stories, once rightly told, never truly end. High above, the last Leonid of the night streaked across the zenith and was gone, leaving only the faint, fading glow of a star that had chosen for one shining moment to fall in the cause of light. Chapter 10. The Final Meridian, November 1957, 30 years to the night. The observatory no longer measured official time. That task had been handed to Hurst-Monceau and the ceaseless whisper of atomic clocks. The great dome still stood, but the 28-inch telescope was rarely used except for public evenings and the occasional research student nostalgic for brass and clockwork. The hill itself felt quieter, as though the centuries had finally granted it permission to rest. Hercule Poirot came one last time. He was 91 now, frail in a way he had never allowed himself to be, leaning lightly on a Malacca cane with an ivory handle worn smooth by decades of use. A ministry car brought him up the familiar gravel. The driver, a young sergeant who had grown up on stories of the little Belgian, handled the wheel as though transporting fragile porcelain. The courtyard was almost empty. A single lamp burned above the octagon room door, and the Meridian line, recently relayed in stainless steel for the benefit of tourists, caught the moonlight like a blade. Young Dr. Jonathan Thorne, no longer young, 40 now, thin-haired and spectacled, waited beneath the arch with his eldest daughter Elizabeth, a serious girl of 15 who had inherited her grandmother's level gaze. They had known he was coming. The letter, written in Poirot's still elegant hand, had arrived a month earlier. If the Leonids are kind, I should like to see them once more from the place where order was restored. Beatrice and Reggie were gone. Beatrice had slipped away peacefully in her sleep 5 years earlier. Reggie followed 18 months later, dying in the library with his head on an open star catalog, as though he had simply decided to join her among the constellations. Their ashes rested together beneath a small stone near the old time ball mast. Jonathan had kept the guest room ready anyway. The sheets aired, a vase of late chrysanthemums on the dresser. Poirot greeted them quietly. His voice was thinner, but the French vowels remained perfect. "You have her eyes," he told Elizabeth, and the girl blushed with pleasure. They did not linger and talk. The sky was waiting. Inside the dome, nothing had changed in essence. The telescope stood polished and silent. The air still carried the faint scent of oil and old brass. Jonathan opened the slit with the electric motor, no longer needing to wind the weights by hand, and the night rushed in, cold and fragrant. They helped Poirot into the observing chair. He sat very upright, coat buttoned to the throat, scarf arranged by Elizabeth with solemn care. The cane rested across his knees like a sword. The Leonids were modest this year. No storm, only a gentle rain of a dozen meteors an hour, yet each one drew a soft ah from the old man as though greeting returning friends. Elizabeth sat on the lower step, knees drawn up, watching his face more than the sky. At 23 minutes past 11, a meteor of exceptional brightness flared low in the east, traveling almost horizontally above the river before breaking into 3 glowing fragments that faded over the city. The dome filled with pale green light for the space of a heartbeat. Poirot smiled, the small private smile that had once unsettled murderers. "There," he whispered. "Did you see? Sir Jonathan sends his regards." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. "He would have been proud of you, monsieur. Of all of us." Poirot did not answer at once. He was looking straight up through the open slit where the stars wheeled in their ancient dance. "I have lived a long time," he said at last, so softly they had to lean close. "Long enough to see many fall, friends, enemies, empires, stars. Yet order returns, always. That is the great comfort." Elizabeth reached out and laid her hand over his. The fingers were papery, bird-light, but they returned the pressure with surprising strength. "Grandfather told me," she said, "that you once said truth is the only chronometer that matters." I wrote it in my notebook. I still have it. Poirot's eyes glistened. Then keep it always, ma petite. And when you are older and the world seems too large and too dark, remember this night. Remember that even fallen stars leave a trail if one knows how to read it. A small silence fell, broken only by the soft ticking of the dome's driving clock. At 10 minutes before midnight, Jonathan saw that Poirot's eyes had closed. For a moment he feared, but the old man's breathing was steady, the smile still curved beneath the famous mustache. Another meteor crossed the slit, smaller, gentler, and Poirot opened his eyes again. "It is time," he said simply. They understood. No one protested. Jonathan closed the slit with reverent care. Elizabeth fetched the wheelchair that had waited discreetly in the corner. Together they guided Poirot down the iron staircase he had once climbed so nimbly across the courtyard where frost was beginning to silver the meridian line, and into the octagon room where a fire had been laid in readiness. He refused brandy, accepted only a little hot milk which he sipped like a child. When the cup was empty, he looked round at the familiar walls, the orrery now still and dust-free, the regulator clock that had measured so many revelations. "Leave me a little while," he asked. "The chair by the window, if you please." They settled him facing the courtyard, a rug over his knees, the cane across his lap. Elizabeth kissed his forehead. Jonathan pressed his shoulder once, wordlessly. Then they withdrew, closing the door softly behind them. Outside, the Leonids continued their quiet pilgrimage. Inside, Hercule Poirot sat alone beneath the ticking clock and watched the meridian line gleam in the moonlight. At 1 o'clock precisely, the time ball, still raised for tradition's sake, dropped with its familiar clack, though no ships now set their chronometers by it. Poirot's lips moved. "Order," he murmured, "and method, and at the last, a little peace." His head sank gently forward. The cane slipped from his lap and rang once upon the floor, a small final sound in a room that had known so many. When they found him an hour later, the smile was still there, serene and satisfied, as though he had just solved the one mystery that had eluded him all his life. They buried him at his own earlier instruction in the small cemetery at the foot of the hill, within sight of the observatory. The stone is simple. Hercule Poirot, 1866–1957. He measured truth with the precision of Greenwich. On clear November nights, the duty astronomer sometimes pauses on the meridian line and looks toward that quiet grave. And if the Leonids are running, one meteor in particular, brighter, slower, almost deliberate, will cross the zenith directly above the stone before dissolving into darkness. Those who know the story smile and say nothing. The stars keep their own counsel, but once in a great while they consent to fall in perfect order, pointing the way home for a small, fastidious man who made the universe a fraction more intelligible and infinitely more kind. And high overhead, the great dome turns gently on its ancient track, keeping watch over time, over memory, and over the quiet certainty that some fallen stars burn forever.